This is the Reducing Economic Hardship, Encouraging Asset Development Among Low-Income Individuals and Families session. So if that's where you want to be, I would encourage you to come close and so we can engage. All right, so I'm Gretchen Lehman. I am the Policy and Partnerships Branch Chief for the Assets for Independence program at the Administration for Children and Families. And you'll be hearing a little bit more about the Assets for Independence program from one of our presenters, so I won't say too much about it other than it's a discretionary grant program administered by ACF that focuses on an asset-based approach to alleviating poverty. And so I'm going to read some brief versions of the bios. The full bios are available in the app, and I'm sure if you Google any of our wonderful presenters, you'll find out more about them. We're going to be going in the order of seating. So I'll start with Carolyn Schultz. Is a research associate at MDRC. Currently, she leads site implementation of the Paycheck Plus study in New York City and Atlanta. Paycheck Plus simulates an expanded earned income tax credit for low-income single workers without dependent children. And previously, she managed 2 MDRC projects, one of which you'll be hearing about today, Save USA, which offered match savings to tax filers, building on savings opportunity presented by tax refunds. And before joining MDRC in 2004, Ms. Schultz worked on program design and evaluation, focusing on neighborhood development and access to family-sustaining jobs. Most recently at the Center on Wisconsin Strategy, she was a program director for Business, Labor, Community Employment Partnership that was implemented in 6 industry sectors. After Ms. Schultz, you'll be hearing from Mark Elliot, the president and founder of the Economic Mobility Corporation, who has more than 25 years of experience in senior positions in public, philanthropic, and nonprofit sectors. He served as the deputy budget director of the City of New York under Mayors Koch and Dinkins, and was a program officer at the Ford Foundation, responsible for economic development and housing portfolios. He was also at the Public-Private Ventures for a while, and while he was there, he led the development and evaluation of several national demonstrations, including Bridges to Work, Fathers at Work, and the Sectoral Employment Impact Study. He's the author of, or co-author of several publications, and he serves as the vice chair of New York City's Workforce Investment Board. And our last presenter will be Dr. Signe-Mary McKernon. She's a national wealth building and poverty expert with nearly 2 decades of experience researching access to assets and credit and the impact of safety net programs. She directs the Urban Institute's Opportunity and Ownerships Initiative and published the book Asset Building in Low-Income Families with Michael Sheridan. She advised the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau when they were creating their research unit. And before joining the Urban Institute in 1999, she was lead economist on credit issues at the Federal Trade Commission. Her research has been published in books, policy briefs, reports, and refereed journals, including the American Economic Review Papers and Proceedings, Demography, and the Review of Economics and Statistics. She's testified before Congress, appeared on several media outlets, and in print, in the New York Times and Washington Post. So we're going to be hearing about 3 different evaluations today, all related to aspects that I would consider related to financial capability. There's a lot of different terms that are being used these days for thinking about the financial well-being, the broader financial life of low-income people. Asset building specifically is a strategy that's been around since the 90s to focus on building tangible and intangible assets such as human capital, home ownership, business ownership, wealth building strategies for low-income people that we've often seen have been very successful for people in the middle class to move up in economic status. And then there's broader ideas around helping people save, integrating services related to credit repair and access to accounts into other places where low-income people are already getting services to think about how to better support their full lives, bring some stability to their economic status, and hopefully help them not only participate in the other programs better, but to have bring more stability to their lives as a whole. So that we're going to be hearing about 3 very different interventions, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions from you all. Thanks. First up, Carolyn Schultz.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Do we have our slides on the?
He's working on it.
Okay.
Try it now.
Good morning.
Push the button. There you go.
That's me. Okay. Okay, I'm Carolyn Schultz. I work for MDRC. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan social policy research firm, and we are best known for specializing in randomized controlled trials, experiments where we evaluate social programs. I'm going to talk today about the Save USA project, which just wound up, and our impact study of the effects of Save USA. This project was funded as part of the Social Innovation Fund, funded by the Corporation for National and Community Service. And we worked closely with the City of New York, Center for Economic Opportunity, and the Office of Financial Empowerment. Save USA was a model that encouraged low and moderate income tax filers to directly deposit a portion or their entire tax refund into a savings account, and then we would offer a match on those savings. This was an unrestricted account. Savings could be used for any purpose, unexpected expenses, or anything that the participant wanted to spend the money on. Save USA was offered in volunteer income tax assistance sites, free tax preparation sites, and tax filers who qualified for the study were approached and invited to participate. They would directly deposit between $200 and $1,000 of their tax refund into a special savings account that they would open as part of the program. If they left those savings in that account for about a year, they'd receive a 50% match on the initial amount that they had pledged. And then this was a 3-year program, so we enrolled everybody at the beginning. People who enrolled in the first year had an opportunity to participate again in the second and third year if they chose to and if they had a tax refund. And then in addition, we also opened up the program to new people in the second and third years. I'm going to be focusing today mainly on the impact study, and the group of people who were involved in that were in a subset of our locations, and they all enrolled in the first year. And I'll talk a little bit more about the research design in a moment. So this special savings account that people opened to be in the program, they were offered by banks and credit unions. We had 7 financial institution partners around the country. All of them agreed to do a very limited or no check systems or other financial history checks. No fees, regardless of the balance in the account, and no penalty for withdrawing the money early, other than the fact that the participant would not be able to earn that 50% savings match at the end of the year. And then we also tried to set some soft barriers to people withdrawing the money. So we encouraged the financial institutions not to offer an ATM account, although if the participant really wanted one, the bank or the credit union would do it for them. So we implemented Save USA in 4 cities: San Antonio, Newark, New York City, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. In New York, we built on a predecessor program called Save NYC, and essentially lifted the same model and implemented it for the purpose of this study and the evaluation. Of those 4 cities, we did implementation research and participation research in all 4 of them, and then 2 of them, New York and Tulsa, we also did an impact study, which I'm mainly going to be talking about today. People were enrolled during the tax season in 2011, and then we followed them all the way through 2014, mainly by looking at those savings account activities for those specialist savings accounts, and then 2 waves of surveys. So in those 2 random assignment cities, New York City and Tulsa, people were, once we determined that they were eligible to be in the study, they enrolled, and then they were randomly assigned to one of 2 groups. The Save USA group would have a chance to open that savings account and potentially earn that 50% match And then there was a control group that we called the regular tax filer group. They were part of the study, but they did not have access to those special accounts or the match payment. In order to sign up for Save USA, and this was true in all of our locations, people needed to be willing to be a part of the study. They had to have adjusted gross income below $50,000 if they had dependent children. If they were filers with no dependent children, they had a lower cap of $25,000 in adjusted gross income in order to be able to enroll. And people had to be, once their taxes were prepared, they had to be seeing that they had at least a $200 refund coming from state, federal, or a combination. People who enrolled in the study, and this includes all 4 cities, their average age was almost 40. About 3/4 of them were women. 88% of them were unmarried, but many of them had dependent children. So almost 1/3 of our participants had at least one dependent child that they claimed on their taxes. And the average AGI for all the participants in the study was about $18,000. To implement the study, we collected a very small amount of baseline data when people first enrolled, both from their tax forms and from a short survey that we administered. Then we tracked the account activity for people who were in the program group, and we implemented those surveys at 18 months and 42 months after they first enrolled during that first tax season. So just to kind of recap the timeline, so spring of 2011, people enroll, they have a chance to deposit into their accounts. The following February was when people would receive their first match payment if they had kept that money in the account. Thank you. And then around that same time, if they wanted to, and if they were getting a tax refund, they could deposit again for another year of program participation and then earn another match the following February, and then a 3rd year the same way. Our final impact study survey was shortly after they became eligible to receive that 3rd and final match in 2014. So I just want to touch briefly on some of the program operation findings. I'm happy to answer questions about these if people want to dig a little bit more deeply into these numbers. But what you see when you look across here is all 4 cities, and just looking at the people who were in the program group. The first year, almost everybody opened a Save USA account, and about 90% of everybody who was in that program group received a direct deposit from their tax refund. So just so you, as we're going through some of these results, just bear in mind there are a few points of drop-off that would make a program group member basically, they're still part of the impact sample, but they're out of the running to get the match payment. So we lost, in that first year, we lost about 10% of people who either couldn't open their account or didn't follow through with that process, or they didn't get an actual deposit into their account, maybe because the IRS captured some money for debt, child support, or back taxes, or a student loan, something like that. Of the people who deposited successfully, the average in the first year was about $500, and then people who came back and participated again the second and third years, for one thing, there were a lot fewer of them. So in the second year, only about 40% of the program group members participated. In the third year, it was under 30%, and the dollar amounts went down a little. The average dollar amounts went down a little bit. Of all the program group members who had a chance to participate, the people who received a savings match, it was about close to 2/3 the first year, and then much lower in the subsequent 2 years because we're including people who didn't participate as well as those who came back and participated again. Just to put this in perspective, not shown on the slide, for each of the 3 years, if you just looked at the people who received that initial, chose to participate, were eligible, had a tax refund again, and got that money put into their account, between 70 and 80% of those folks earned that 50% match payment in a given year. It went up slightly over the course of the 3 years, and if you think about it, you would sort of expect that because the people who come back and participate again are, we speculate, probably a little bit more confident. Right. They're going to be able to leave the money untouched. And then lastly, the average dollar of the match payments. So that number went up each year, again, I think because of some self-selection of who wanted to participate in years 2 and 3. Also, people who successfully earned the match tended to be making larger deposits as the program went on. And so people who made smaller deposits, maybe they had less wiggle room or they were being more conservative, they were a little more likely to pull the money out and not earn the match. So those numbers on the bottom of this slide, those include both people who earned, the second to last row includes people who did earn the match as well as people who didn't, and then the bottom one is just among people who did earn the match. Okay, so I want to talk about the impacts. So what you see here is the red bar is our regular tax filers control group. And we wanted to look at the end of the 3 years of the program implementation, now this is just looking at our impact study cities of Tulsa and New York City. We wanted to see, did we see any cumulative or persistent effects of participating in the program? When we asked people after their 3rd tax season if they deposited any of their tax refund into any kind of savings account, 41% of the control group said they did, which is a little high, but also remember, everybody in this study is sort of a motivated saver from the outset. And then, could you show me my time check? Okay, thanks. And then, even though everyone was motivated, participating in the program was able to boost the incidence of people depositing their money into savings by about 6 percentage points, and that's the blue bar that you see here, and that's our Save USA program group. Save USA increased the percent of people who had any non-retirement savings, and during the Q&A I can give you a list, but it was basically kind of anything you can think of that would be considered defined as a source of, as an asset that's not earmarked for retirement. We did see an effect. The control group had about close to 3/4 of them had some non-retirement savings, but 80% of the program group did. So we had an impact of about 8 percentage points. And then when we looked at the dollar amounts, the dollar amount difference, kind of representing the same pattern, was about $522. And just to give you a point of reference, if you remember back a few slides ago, the total cumulative match payments, average match payments for the program group came to $365. So this $522 is not entirely explained by the money that people were actually paid through the program. Now I want to look at a couple of things. And by the way, there were other kind of similar effects driven by savings, so things like asset poverty, liquid assets, things you would expect to also go up. However, we didn't see any effects, positive or negative, on debt. A slight difference, but not statistically significant. We actually thought this was a good finding because it meant people didn't take out some kind of debt in order to maintain that Save USA money in that Save USA account and earn the match. We also didn't see any change in the use of high-cost credit or reported financial hardship, which we measured in multiple ways. Things like not being able to pay rent or utilities, postponing a visit to the doctor because of costs, or reducing prescription use because of costs, having a phone disconnected, those kinds of hardships. And we asked about many more as well. These effects were pretty consistent across all of our major subgroups, including both of the impact study cities, New York and Tulsa, participant age, participant income level, educational attainment, how they filed their taxes, and several other measures. Overall, we think that Save USA demonstrated that this kind of model can lead to sustained increases in non-retirement savings. There's some amplification effect beyond just the match payment, but we don't think it's sort of enough in itself to build a complete asset building plan. So we imagine that this kind of a model could be implemented as federal tax policy, but it would have to also be part of a mix of interventions that would build financial security. And if you want to read more detail about this report, it's on our website, mdrc.org. You can just look up Save USA, and you can see the final impact findings that were just released a little while ago. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Gretchen, I can use the podium.
Yep, you sure can. Here's the
Hold
clicker.
this. I'm actually going to stand up because we can see the slides on this big TV here, but I kept on having to crane my neck over the table to watch Caroline. So it's nice to have everybody here in such an intimate setting. Everyone can each get their own table, own water, etc. I'm Mark Elliott, as Gretchen introduced me. I'm going to be talking about findings from our evaluation of the Local Initiative Support Corporation's Financial Opportunity Centers. Unlike Caroline, I put my data up front. I figure, at the end, you might not want to have any of my contact information. So, and I included my Twitter handle there. If anybody wants to follow me, I follow you back. Become a big Twitter fan after following my daughter as a journalist in Houston. So I blame it all on her. The Financial Opportunity Center's model is based on something called the Center for Working Families. People may be familiar with it. It's developed by the Annie Casey Foundation, who trademarked the name. So when LISC started using it, they had to use their own name, Financial Opportunity Centers. It really attempts to integrate 3 different kinds of services: employment, job readiness training, and one-on-one job search assistance. Assistance with accessing public benefits if people are not already receiving them. And then perhaps the most innovative part of the program, extensive financial counseling, which included budgeting as well as credit building. Okay, I can barely see this chart myself from here. The evaluation was a quasi-experimental design. LISC absolutely refused to do a random control trial evaluation, although they would have been better served if they had. In this case, I don't often recommend RCTs, but they really wanted to do a comparison group. The 5 organizations that were part of it were organizations that had been running this program for several years, and they had been selected by LISC as those that they felt were doing the best job of implementing the FOC model. Unfortunately, one of them, Association House, essentially went out of business. So while they had been one of the best, that was a problem, and that program had to be transferred to another nonprofit. But Instituto, CARA, North Lawndale, for anybody who knows Chicago, these are some of the marquee nonprofit organizations. You see here the date, the scale of the program. We tracked employment, net income, and net worth, although we thought it was very ambitious to be thinking about things like net worth 2 years after our program. LISC had made that kind of commitment. This was all funded by the Social Innovation Fund, so as part of their proposal, they had made very strong claims about the impact on net worth, and so that had to be part of the evaluation. We did develop a relationship with TransUnion that enabled us to access people's credit reports. I don't know, how many people here are familiar with their own credit? How many have checked your own credit in the last few months? See, I had no idea. I had never checked my credit. I just knew it was okay, so I never really worried about it. But I learned a lot about credit through this project, and there's a lot to know. Here's, for anybody who knows Chicago, the locations of the organizations on Chicago's south and west sides. Something about the demographics of the participants, mostly minorities, never married. They're a little bit older than we typically see in the evaluations that we've done. Obviously quite poor. Credit scores. Okay, a credit score can range anywhere. You can be unscored, and if you have a score, it can range from 300 to 850. Essentially, a credit score is a simple way of describing risk associated with extending you credit or a loan. We see here for the FOC participants, 41% had too little credit activity to have a score at all. When you see the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and others talk about credit, they never talk about the numbers of people who are unscored. Obviously, it's hard to track them. They talk about people with scores. But here for a low-income population coming into these programs, 41% had no credit score. Overall, including those who had subprime scores, and we define subprime as 620, many would say 620 is too low. You should have 640, 660 to really have a prime credit score. So together we had 83% who had a subprime score or no score. A significant barrier. For those who have good credit, never have had bad credit, you may be surprised at some of the ways bad credit can hurt you. Employers, and this varies from city to city, can use applicants' credit as a screening mechanism. Your mortgage and auto loan rates can be much higher. Landlords are using credit checks as a way of screening would-be renters. Cell phones and utilities. Most low-income people need cell phones and utilities. They're not luxuries. That can cost several $100s in a cash deposit before you can open an account. Car insurance, private student loans, and of course credit cards are much more expensive. I'm going to share with you a story of one gentleman we met as part of doing this work, because I think it'll put in really sharp relief how important credit could be. When Eugene was released from prison in 2012, he went to several organizations in Chicago looking for job search assistance. All of them turned him down because of his record. Could you pass me my water? Thank you. All of them turned him down except for the North Lawndale Employment Network, which had whose U-turn program was specifically designed to help ex-offenders. After he completed the 4-week program, Eugene was hired as a receptionist at North Lawndale, making minimum wage. By living with his mother, Eugene was able to save some money and soon had his heart set on a 2005 Cadillac CTS. I've been saving my money to buy a car. I went to the dealership and I was telling the guy I had $2,500 in cash. But he wouldn't let me walk off the lot with that car because I had no credit. He turned me down, and the very next day he sold the car to someone else with only $500 down. Eugene had not taken advantage of North Lawndale's financial counseling program, but now he realized he needed to improve his credit. You can have all the cash you want, but it's not going to matter if you have no credit. He enrolled in North Lawndale's Twin Accounts program, I'll talk a little bit more about that later, and began making monthly payments on a loan to improve his credit. Within 6 months, Eugene had moved from being unscored to having a prime score of 677. And once again, he began looking to buy a car, which he now needed desperately to replace the aging Ford Taurus he had used to commute to his new job, that he was using to commute to his new job at a candy manufacturer outside of Chicago, about 30 minutes from home by automobile, but basically impossible to reach by public transportation. Before he purchased a car, Eugene had used his improved credit history to get a credit card from Kay Jewelers. I think you know where this is going. Which he let his brother use to buy a bracelet for his girlfriend. Despite his promises to the contrary, Eugene's brother failed to make the payments on the card. When Eugene found out, he paid off the entire balance, but it was too late. The card was canceled and his hard-earned credit card was damaged, dropping his score to 588, which lenders consider subprime. Eugene eventually found a 2003 Ford Explorer that he liked for about $8,500. When he first visited the dealership, he was told he could get a loan for 9%, but when he came back, the dealer told him the rate would actually be 26% because of his poor credit. Eugene contacted more than a dozen lenders but couldn't find a better offer. So he put the $2,000 down and financed the remainder over 3 years. Eugene's been making auto loan payments consistently for several months, which is making him more attractive to lenders. I get so many pieces of mail now, some from the same companies that were denying me. You're pre-approved for this or pre-approved for that. I just scrap it. I just throw it away, he says, laughing. I do have a Visa card now from a major bank. Well, if we were looking at Eugene just from an employment basis, we would think, well, he started at a minimum wage job. Now he's got a promotion. He's working at a manufacturer, making above minimum wage. Things are going well. But by including credit, we get a much better picture of what's actually happening in terms of his financial perspective, financial world. So a little bit more about the results. Here you see of the study participants, what kind of services they received. 65% got met with any FOC counselor, meaning 34+% did not meet with any FOC counselor, very important in terms of the evaluation. You can see the duration, if they met with a counselor, how long they were in touch with any of the counselors. Here you see the comparison group I didn't mention were a group of job seekers who sought assistance from Chicago's one-stops, right? So we were trying to control for motivation in designing the comparison group, and we used propensity score matching to really try to remove any bias between the two groups. Here we describe the kinds of assistance that people got. It's important to see that the FOC members were much more likely to receive the assistance in terms of employment, income, and credit, although less likely in terms of applying for benefits. It's kind of sad for people like me, who's on this New York City's Workforce Development Board, see how few people got any employment assistance from the one-stops, but from the study perspective, it was good. In terms of findings, we did see, I wanted to present, when we did the evaluation, not just the impacts after the program, which would be the bars on the right, the 36 versus 31, but what happened in the year before program entry as well. This is often not included in evaluations, but when people are looking at outcomes from programs, they look at the pre and the post, and they look at the difference, and they think, wow, that's a huge increase. Well, the truth is, and anyone who's done this kind of evaluation knows this, there's always an increase in things like employment before someone goes into a program and afterwards, even if that's, they're not getting any assistance. So here we can see that with both groups, but the FOC group was more likely to be employed year-round than the comparison group, and that difference was statistically significant. In terms of annual earnings, the increases were very similar, and there was no impact. They had net income greater than zero. Actually, the comparison group did a little bit better than the FOC group. And that was because while average monthly income went up, average monthly expenditures did as well. We did see on the credit side that the FOC participants were significantly more likely than comparison group members to have positive activity on their credit reports. The percent with any trade accounts paid as agreed was significantly higher, and the average number of on-time payments made during the year was also much higher. Right? The trade accounts paid as agreed is essentially paying your bill on time with at least the minimum payment that's been asked for. but that did not translate into an increase in the percent who had a credit score or a change in credit scores. It actually takes quite a lot of consistent activity to really improve a credit score. Gretchen said this chart was impossible to understand, but I'm going to try to do it anyway. This is looking at the subgroups of the participants. We essentially remember the big slice of the pie that was unscored. Well, there's also, even if you're scored, you could have what's called a thin file or a thick file. A thin file means you have fewer than 3 trade accounts. And it's just less information for lenders to really be able to assess how worthy you are for credit. If you have a thick file, you have 3 accounts or more. So ideally, you want to have a prime score and also a thick file. So we did see that there was a change in percent of the unscored who had credit scores after 2 years as compared to the comparison group, and that's statistically significant. And the percent who moved to a prime score was statistically significant among those with a thick file, although not with the other 2 groups. How'd I do, Gretchen? It was understandable? All right, good. We saw no impact in terms of net worth, and we did see some reduction in debts that were things like medical debts and legal debts, things unrelated to assets, so another positive sign. The FCC members that got really what would be considered the minimum program services in order to really essentially achieve what LISC thought they should be able to achieve. Here we saw pretty consistent impacts, and to me this said a lot about the potential of the program, even though we didn't really see large impacts across the entire program group and comparison group. But if you did get the services, you were more likely to have a prime credit scored and be employed year-round than the comparison group. Getting nervous about that time card popping up here. And average annual earnings and hours worked were both statistically significantly higher for that 37% who got the at least 2 meetings with the counselors. I mentioned the twin accounts. This really did not figure in our evaluation because very few participants got them while they were enrolling in the study. But I think they're a really innovative tool and worth really wider use. It doesn't have to be with LISC's twin accounts, but these kinds of credit building tools I think can be very important. The way it worked, the participants were issued a 12-month $300 loan, which was essentially put in a locked account. They repaid that loan in 12 monthly payments of $26.24. If they made the payment on time, LISC matched that dollar for dollar. Payments, and this is the creative part, were reported to the credit bureaus. So all 3 credit bureaus got those reports. And by year end, if they had made the 12 payments on time, participants had improved credit and $600 in savings. And LISC is, with data since the evaluation, has said that for people who are enrolling in these who are unscored at the time they start, if they make the 12 monthly payments, their scores average 630. And for those who are scored, their scores are going up by about 60 points, enough to give them a prime score. And with that, I'll conclude right at the stop sign.
Great. Well, it's terrific to be here to present some new research today on individual development accounts, early impacts from a randomized evaluation of the AFI for Independence program. And this research is a collaboration with the Urban Institute, RTI, and MEF, and several of the program team members are here today. Sarah Edelstein from Urban, who will help me answer any difficult questions. See Sam Elkin out there from MEF, and Emma Kalish here too from the Urban Institute, and I think I saw a Nupa beer from RTI earlier. It was very exciting to see the Save USA findings that the poor can save. I get that question all the time, and it's a study that I cite often in that answer. And I think we're about to present some new exciting evidence that poor and low-income families can save given incentives. This study was supported with funding from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families. And the study addresses the following research question. What is the short-term impact of Assets for Independence program participation on outcomes such as savings, asset purchases, and material hardship? And we refer here to short-term impacts about 1 year into program participation. And we've answered this question with an experimental design with study participants randomly assigned into the treatment group, and they participate in the program, and into a control group who don't in each study site. And this random evaluation design allows us to attribute differences in outcomes to the program itself. Well, what is the AFI program? AFI is a federally supported IDA grant program authorized under the Assets for Independence Act of 1998. Gretchen described it a little bit. This program is administered at the federal level by the Office of Community Services within the Administration for Children and Families. And AFI uses IDAs, individual development accounts, and financial education to help low-income individuals move out of poverty and toward greater self-sufficiency. And individual development accounts, these are special savings accounts that match your deposit when you save toward a specific asset purchase. In this case here, it's first-time home purchase, business capitalization, and post-secondary education or training. The two participating sites on our evaluation are in Albuquerque and Los Angeles. One is Prosperity Works with a grant operated in a community college setting. And in Albuquerque, these IDA services are provided in an on-campus student center, which offers academic and financial coaching and then connects students to college and community resources. The other site is Rise Financial Pathways in Los Angeles. This is a standalone community-based nonprofit organization that generally doesn't offer other services to IDA participants or AFI program participants. And then at both sites, program participants were allowed to save a maximum savings amount of $1,000 for a match. And in Albuquerque, participants could receive $4 for every dollar that they saved, so they could get $4,000 toward that purchase. And in Los Angeles, it was $2.50 for every dollar saved. So the data from the study are based on a baseline survey, on qualitative interviews, on program data, and then on a follow-up survey that took place roughly 12 months after the baseline survey and random assignment. 807 individuals were enrolled into the study, and this is in 2013 and the first half of 2014. And then the main data source for measuring our first-year outcomes is the short-term follow-up survey, and the total response rate was 78%. So this was great, and it was RTI that administered the survey. Let's get right into the findings. I'm going to focus here, I'm going to present our regression-adjusted impacts. And these models are estimated including the baseline value of the outcome variable. We're also controlling for individual characteristics at baseline and then which site they participated in. And one key result is that AFI increased participant savings as measured by total liquid assets. Liquid assets include amounts in savings and checking accounts, money market accounts, their individual development accounts, stocks, bonds, and retirement savings, among other savings. And AFI led up to a 7 percentage point increase in the share of participants with liquid assets at the one-year follow-up interview. And the 3 stars there on that 7 percentage point increase mean that they're statistically significant. This increase is statistically significant at the 1% level. So the vast majority, 89% of treatment group members had some liquid assets at the one-year follow-up. And when we look at the dollar increase, we see that AFI participants increased their liquid assets by $799, significant at the 10% level. And this increase is measured over roughly 1 year, so it corresponds with monthly increases of about $67 in savings. So the finding suggests that financial incentives designed to encourage AFI participants to save did just that. We see savings here on our primary outcomes. And it's important to note that this is total liquid savings, not just savings in their IDA account. And so participants are not simply just shifting assets from one account to an account where they get an incentive to save. This is an increase in their total liquid savings. Well, we hypothesized that the AFI program would reduce material hardship through maybe unmatched emergency savings or hardship withdrawals. And we do find evidence that the AFI program participation reduced hardship as measured by the total number of hardships a person experienced, the number of times a participant was unable to pay a utility bill, and a decline in the likelihood of medical hardship. That is, you can't afford a doctor, a dentist, or a prescription when you need one. But as I'll show on the next slide, that there's a range of explanations for this finding beyond unmatched withdrawals. Maybe it was not just emergency savings. So what we found is that another possible explanation for our reduced material hardship is that AFI participants had higher benefit receipt in means-tested programs such as TANF, SSI, SNAP, and other food-related assistance or Medicaid. So the treatment group benefits were roughly 7 percentage points higher than the control group. And so why might AFI participation increase benefit receipt? Well, possibly because the financial education that's coupled with the programs, one component of the program, can help eligible people find out where they can apply for benefits and keep them connected with benefits while they're eligible and need them. So these benefits could then help participants avoid material hardship. We also looked at alternative financial service outcomes. And what we found is that AFI reduces alternative non-bank check cashing, and this could happen by connecting participants with a bank account through their individual development account. We find no evidence that AFI reduces use of alternative financial sector credit products such as payday loans, auto title, or pawn shop loans. We also find evidence that AFI improved participants' financial security. It improved it for 3 out of the 4 measures that we looked at. Participants were more confident that they can meet their monthly living expenses. And this is a promising finding because increases in liquid assets among AFI participants could have led AFI participants to report having more difficulty paying their expenses. When you're saving, sometimes it's harder to meet those expenses. More participants also said, relative to the control group, that their financial situation has gotten better. Fewer said that their financial situation had gotten worse. And then we found no significant change in how easy or hard it was to make ends meet, our 4th measure. Looking at the remaining outcomes we examined, we find little to no evidence that AFI program participation in the short term improves credit scores, self-esteem, or general health, and then present-oriented time preference. We also didn't find a statistically significant effect right now on net worth or employment and earnings, and I have those in a very light gray here because in the short term, as mentioned, you could actually hypothesize increases or decreases in net worth. So we expected potentially an overall 0 effect on both of those outcomes. And then so light that you can't see it because we didn't hypothesize any effect in the short term is the effect of AFI participation on targeted asset purchases, on that home ownership, business capitalization, or on community involvement. And those we did not expect to see effects now in the short term. It generally takes more than 1 year to save for those purchases, and the program's saving periods are longer than that. All right, so what about implications? Well, the study finding that AFI participation reduced alternative financial sector check cashing and increased the share of people with a bank account suggests that the IDAs can help people, and the AFI program help people enter the financial mainstream. And this quote from the implementation study helps put a face on this finding. So a young woman who is close to aging out of the foster system comes back to pick up her bank passbook in order to make her first deposit. She had a small paycheck. "Can you help me with something?" she asked. She asked if I can teach her how to make a bank deposit. and what to do with that first paycheck. Yep, I got a little choked, gave her a hug, and we entered a Banking 101 conversation. We think that some of the key findings from the short-term evaluation have important implications. The evaluation's finding that AFI increased savings suggests that the program achieved one of its key goals. Through savings or through keeping eligible participants, people connected with benefits, the AFI program also reduces hardship. Importantly, participation in the AFI program reduces financial worry. And this finding is important in the context of behavioral economics research on scarcity. As Mullainathan and Shafir explained, financial stress and worry tend to sap our cognitive resources at the very time when we need them most in order to not make poor choices. The reduction in financial worry is also important in the context of toxic stress and its impact on children. So turning to potential policy and practice implications, the findings suggest that the AFI program plays an important role in an integrated service delivery system. As an HHS-administered program, it's important to consider AFI in the context of HHS's broad strategic goals, not solely in terms of asset building. AFI grantees nationwide integrate their IDA programs into other programmatic activities that serve low-income households by providing benefits, social services, and other assistance. AFI participation and the savings it encourages may be a mechanism for meeting other HHS goals, such as keeping eligible low-income people connected to benefits and reducing hardship, thus meeting goals beyond asset building. And then the strong supportive evidence presented that the AFI program successfully achieved its primary short-term goal of increased participant savings come from two programs with very differing designs, such as the match rate, and also contrasting service delivery approaches, a community college with complementary services versus a standalone organization. So matched savings programs, such as individual development accounts, and the AFI program in particular, provide a vehicle for public policies to encourage low-income families to save in ways that can promote their short-term stability and as a foundation for their longer-term upward mobility. So the AFI program demonstration could become a permanent program with the flexibility to innovate over time, as many programs needed to do after the Great Recession, and within the context of HHS's goals. And there are both administrative and legislative proposals to make AFI more flexible. So you've seen now our brand new AFI findings, and it's so important, I think, because there's so few incentives for low-income people to save. Most of the benefits go to high-income people because they're offered through the tax code, and so this is one of the few incentives to save. And for, if you'd like to receive a copy of this report when it comes out, I think we expect it out in the fall. You can sign up for our Opportunity and Ownership monthly newsletter. We also are getting ready to release some findings on asset limits in the SNAP program. You can find our financial coaching evaluation on our website. And we have also some research on why financial security matters for cities and how the wealth of Americans have changed over the last half century. So feel free to give me your business card to sign up or on the website. Thank you.
Is this already on? Oh, okay. I'm like, the light's not on. So while there are some microphones in the room for questions, and there also may be some questions on the live stream. While you're thinking about your questions, I neglected to tell you at the beginning that you can get these PowerPoint presentations by sending an email to request them to RECS, R-E-C-S, at impact, IMPAQINT.com. Hopefully that information is not just available to you by me saying it. I'll say it again, RECS at IMPAQINT.com. And then I'll just say a little bit, Signe-Mary mentioned that there are some administrative proposals around the Assets for Independence program. We have had in the past, which again, I work on. And in the past couple of president's budgets, we have put forward proposals, most recently for creating an asset innovation fund to use up to 30% of the AFI funding appropriation to allow for more experimentation. We've heard from the field that, and there's been a lot of innovation as the sorts of things that we're seeing with the twin accounts from LISC and the Save USA demonstrations, experimentation with asset building to move beyond just the 3 assets that AFI currently allows, and also to think about ways of reaching populations such as youth aging out of foster care who may not be in a place where they're ready to buy a first home or start a business, may have other resources for post-secondary education or training, and could really use some additional options for asset building. So we've put forward some proposals around that. It would take it would take congressional action for those things to change, but that's part of the conversation that we in the administration have been trying to put forward. Question from John?
Thank you. Great work and great presentations. John Tambernino, Ask BHHS. Wonder if, in particular, Signe-Mary and Carolyn could think more about related issues of targeting and scaling. So the AFI program is relatively small. The Save USA, of course, is a very small pilot. But the target population is really rather large. The income levels for eligibility go up high. So we're talking about millions and millions of households or families that, in theory, were sort of within the target population. So one question is just envisioning a scaling up of these programs in terms of infrastructure, capacity for organizations that would be necessary to really be reaching, again, a rather large population. That's the ultimate sort of target of these programs. And then the question of targeting in the sense of, do we think of the AFI sort of program as something that would be universalized in the sense that it would ideally be something that most of these households would participate in? Or is it more of sort of a focused, strategic kind of program, appropriate both for households who have these goals of wanting to save, say, to start a small business, and also just who have motivation that's likely atypical, really. So just that, targeting, scaling, expansion, and what would be envisioned and what's realistic for these kinds of interventions.
Go ahead.
I'll say a couple things, and then we can turn to Signe-Mary. The vision that the New York City Office of Financial Empowerment had for this intervention, and others are still carrying that torch. Some of Jonathan Mintz's group, Cities for Financial Empowerment, and others. New America works on this quite a bit as well. That vision is that a Save USA-like model could be built into the tax code. And your point is very well taken about the scale and the fact that many, many millions of Americans would be eligible for, if we used our existing Save USA guidelines, a $50,000 cap for people with dependent children, $25,000 for those without. I think there need to be, I think political will would be a question, but I think, just to, and we're kind of, I'm not, I think we're, when we think about this, we think of it in the context of the whole variety of incentives that are built into the tax code. So if you think about something like the mortgage interest deduction, which typically benefits higher income families, similarly, a lot of retirement savings incentives that are built into the tax codes, those are very large dollar amounts, very large scale components of the tax code. So I think, how realistic is it that something like this would become part of it? I think, that if that happens, I think it would be quite a bit down the road. I don't envision it being something as a kind of a small boutique program, although there has been some sustainability work done on post-Save USA. So where the money is there locally, I think it's a very viable model. And then I guess I'll just end with, the question of, if underlying philosophical question about Save USA, And we don't know how we feel about this either. Is it sort of just a windfall for people who would save otherwise? Or is it really starting to build a habit of saving? We have some evidence that it does have those kinds of effects, but they're modest. And I think, lastly, it's important to remember that even if someone doesn't earn their match payment, there could be potential positive effects. We didn't detect these, but things like being prepared for a financial emergency. So you put the money away after the tax season, it's sitting there, you're hoping to earn that 50% match, but then perhaps in September, something happens, you have an emergency and you need that money. Perhaps over time you could see reductions in people, having to struggle to meet emergency expenses. But I should say, we didn't detect those kinds of effects, but I think that those are part of the philosophical questions about this model.
Yeah,
I think it may be on, just.
I'm sorry, it's on? Okay. So I think, John, you asked a terrific question, and Carolyn touched on some of the same points I wanted to say. So the U.S. spends over roughly $400 billion a year to encourage asset building. But it primarily goes to high-income families. And if you take the mortgage interest tax deduction and preferential treatment for retirement savings, 70% of those benefits go into high-income families. Those programs have not been evaluated. There's not been a random control trial evaluation of the mortgage interest tax deduction. And if anywhere there's going to be shifted savings, or in the case of the mortgage interest tax deduction, just incentives to buy larger homes and take on more debt, it's there. So now we take one of the smallest programs, what is it, like 1% of the asset building budget, and we hold it to so much of a higher standard that when it comes to encouraging low-income people to save, we're going to do a random control trial evaluation, like here, show that the savings are new. So I think instead of just discouraging savings through the asset limits we have in our means-tested programs, here is one opportunity to encourage that savings, set it up and make it easy. So I think it's so important. Michael Sheridan's original vision for individual development accounts were universal, lifelong accounts, and what we've seen with the Assets for Independence program is one small dose of that. But we've seen important effects from that one small dose, and not just shifted savings. Low-income and poor families are much less likely to shift their savings, so they don't have those initial savings to shift. And we've seen experiences with material hardship too. So scale is a question. It's been one that the field's been looking at over years. And we see programs going to larger scale, such as Save USA, programs through the tax code and earned income tax credit. Match is one way to scale up a program. Here, we were very excited to have one of our sites, evaluation sites, be at a community college. There's another way to scale a program. And there's other exciting IDA programs out, like Arizona's Earn to Learn, which are helping people get, through college. So I think there are mechanisms to scale. We would want incentives to save to be broader. And then in terms of targeting, universal makes things easier, but, and if match savings, we would have to take some of that funding from the mortgage interest tax deduction and put it toward, other saving incentives that benefit all Americans, not just high-income Americans.
We have a question from the live stream.
This question is from Jeff Sims at HHS, and it is about the AFI evaluation. He asks, did the study find that the effects on savings were beyond the amount of the match received, similar to the outcome found by Save USA?
What these savings, a lot of the participants have not received their match yet. We're only 1 year in, and it takes participants longer than that 1 year to save for their match. So these are just, there's no match involved in that. That $799 increase was all on behalf of the participant, roughly $67 a month in new savings.
the match actually occurs at the point of asset purchase, not during the savings period, and so it was not counted within that number. Great. Other questions in the room? So one thing that I thought was interesting, especially coming off of our earlier presentation this morning, where there's a lot of conversation about material hardship, and also just about sort of the future of benefits and who is being served by the current benefit system and perhaps who is not. I thought it was interesting, you know, it was quite surprising to me to not see an effect on Save USA for the financial hardship measures, and I was, but I also was wondering, it seemed like that was perhaps a rolled up number, and I'm wondering if you did, you know, on the AFI evaluation, they separated out each of the 9 measures and looked specifically in each of them to see if any one of them had any impact. And was that true for you for all of the individual measures that you looked at, that there still was no impact?
Yes, that's right. There were some differences, not statistically significant, and we looked at, I think, most of the measures that you also looked at. I mentioned some of them, but we also asked about things like, you know, was there a change in what kind of method you used to, or you would use to cover emergency expenses? We asked questions about to see if people had, how much self-reported worry they had about their finances, how much control they felt over them. I think in fact we asked it in more ways than we expected to, and we just didn't find it. And you know, I think I wouldn't say that doesn't mean there's nothing going on there. I think the original logic model hypothesized that first you'd see the changes in the savings behavior, and that might build into other things. And we did see the changes in savings behavior. And again, you know, even among people who were in the program group but weren't earning matches. So I think, you know, it's just a little hard for us to tell what to make of that. I think we were hoping we would see, you know, some of those tick marks, but we I don't know if the follow-up wasn't long enough, or, you know, there are any number of reasons.
I was going to add, I know one thing is, if you just look at has anybody experienced any material hardship over a period, it's generally pretty high for both the treatment and control group. And in the AFI evaluation survey, we said, well, how many times? How many times did you experience this hardship? And so I wonder if part of the difference in the findings is measuring that intensity, and that's where we're picking up the effects in AFI.
Yeah, I think I'd have to double check that. I think we asked that question only about now. So at 18 months, and then again at, but not how many times.
Not how many times,
but
right.
just you know, have you, I think it was in the past month.
Yeah.
So it was more of a snapshot, not trying to get people to sort of tally it.
Right, so if the treatment group said they experienced it 3 times, and the control group said they experienced it 6 times, right, they both would have ever experienced it, and you wouldn't pick up an effect.
That's a very good point.
But that there would be, you know,
An actual effect.
An actual effect, because you know, people experience material hardship more often than you would actually think, in terms of that ability to pay that utility bill, to put food on the table.
Right, it's monthly.
Yeah.
I mean, multiple occasions, there's opportunities multiply every month for something. Question?
Hi. Yeah, thank you all to the panelists. This has been by far my favorite panel so far. Really, really informative and impressive work. I am really curious about the client or participant retention rate. So in I think it was the first presentation from Caroline. So you mentioned that obviously participation rates of success are higher when people self-select, when they have the choice to participate, when they say, I am choosing to be financially responsible, I am choosing to participate in this program. So I guess how can we increase participation and get clients to keep coming back to services to really make sure that they want to make the decision to do that? Not that we're like imposing financial responsibility on someone who's not ready for that step. Does this question make sense? Okay, thank you.
Well, I'll just say that, you probably figured this out, but, so the people who came back in the second year weren't identical to the people who came back in the third year. So it wasn't a steady drop-off, there was a little shuffling. And we based a little bit on what we saw in our 18-month survey. I think that it reflects what you would, what common sense would tell you about changes in people's financial situations, whether they're getting a tax refund this year like they did last year and so on. And so I think that this kind of a model, if it's offered as part of the tax system, assumes that you'd have some people stepping in and out, just like people do with other kinds of credits, when they file their taxes. Again, depending on, okay, what were my actual financial numbers last year? What do I want? What can I afford to do? What's my current situation? What are my plans for this year? All of those financial planning, tax planning decisions that people make would affect it. And I think the only real world indicator that I can think of to contemplate is the earned income tax credit has some analogous aspects in that people don't earn it every year. It's tied to work behavior and earnings. And it's also taken some years for people to sort of know it's there, people to understand and be, when they do thinking ahead about, oh, that's that thing that I got last year or my sister got, and so on. So I think there's an assumption built in that you wouldn't expect people to participate every year. There'd be some churning, people moving in and out of eligibility, in and out of their desire and ability to save with a model like that.
I'll just comment briefly on this because I think it's a factor in our study. I think it's a really important question because I think a lot of times when folks design these kinds of programs, they have a certain kind of participation in mind for what's going to be required to really gain the benefit. That's often very different from the people who are being served, what they have in mind for how they would like to benefit. And unless that's really thought through and analyzed, you're not going to really understand what's the likely participation rate. So in the Financial Opportunity Center evaluation, folks were really coming to these organizations for help finding a job. They weren't coming in saying, I want integrated services with a job and benefits and credit counseling. Those things were being offered, and sometimes folks saw the benefit and took advantage of it. But by and large, when folks got assistance with a job or didn't get assistance with a job, they were moving on. I think the twin accounts tool, although it wasn't very relevant during the duration of our study period, is a kind of tool that can really encourage participation because it has that monthly reward. And it's also for workforce development organizations, it's a way if people are not making the payment, it's kind of a early warning system that something may be wrong, they maybe lost their job, that they'll quickly intervene. So while we struggled, I think participation was a key factor in the fact there weren't consistent impacts. I do believe that kind of tool can really encourage folks to continue to participate.
May I just add one very quick thing about that? The other thing to think about for that question is the question of whether you're going to have boutiques or sort of any door access. So something like Save USA, you had to go to a specific subset of free tax preparers. You have not moved out of town. You had to not be seeking a refund anticipation loan, which wasn't offered through those sites, and so on. So I think it's not necessarily to say like, yes, this should be universal, everybody should have access to all of these programs, but just that when you decide how universal it is and how widely available it is, that will have effect on people who are literally moving around, but also whose finances and other situations, the characteristics are moving and changing.
So that brings us to the end of our panel. You've all got about 28 minutes to get your lunch and then come back here for the next plenary symposium, excuse me. So please join me in thanking our panel.